All right, we're live.
So, guys, tonight we're going to have a little discussion about the spawn. In my opinion, understanding the spawn is probably the most important aspect of bass fishing that you could potentially entertain. If you know and understand the spawn really good, that gives you a lot of intel of where fish are before they spawn, where they're going to go, and just understanding how a fish behaves, why they spawn, where they spawn. Such an integral part of being a really good angler that I think it you owe it to yourself to invest some time in it. Now, with that being said, this is probably, in my opinion, one of the most subjective subjects to cover in bass fishing because it's so relative to where you are in the country. It's so relative to the species. It's so relative to just the year. I know growing up, there's certain things about the spawn that my dad would always tell me, like, oh, they come up on this side of the lake first, or they come up in the northeast section of the lake first. And as I started to fish and I started to pay attention to all these things, I realized it really wasn't that simple. It could vary. How long the spawn lasts from year to year varies drastically where I live. How early they come up, it varies drastically where I live, and it's all dependent on a lot of different factors. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So, one thing we're doing in the app this year, we're partnering with Science of the Strike. These one thing I love about Sam and Corbin is they aren't just repeating things that they have read. I guess kind of are repeating things they've read in a way, but it's science based that they're sharing with us. And so I know in the industry, especially in the media part of the industry, we figure out what everybody else is saying and then get in line with that without actually trying it by fire, by experience. So I really appreciate the way that they study and break down things. So that's why we're partnering with them. This conversation is going to be really helpful to a lot of people tonight. So pay attention. Grab a notebook if you need to. I would. I mean, I got my notebook right here in front of me too. I would grab a notebook and pay attention to kind of the subjects we're going to cover. I think there was what five really, I guess, major topics we are going to cover: the anatomy of the spawn. What were the other four, Mike? I don't remember. We made those little slides where I don't remember what the other four were. Anatomy of the spawn. Was it like where bass spawn? Something like that.
Give me a second.
Let's see. I got the slide. Yeah, me. I got it somewhere too. Let me look for it here. Here we go. Anatomy of the spawn.
Water
That's one
level.
of the subjects we're going to cover. We're going to talk about moon phases. That's a very contentious topic amongst fishermen. I got big feelings about the moon. How different species spawn, depending on what species you fish for, that has a lot of bearing to do with how you how you attack the spawn. What triggers the spawn? How do you know fish are spawning? What makes that happen? We're going to talk about that, and that's it. So anatomy of the spawn, what triggers the spawn, and how different species spawn. There's going to be moon phases as well, but there's going to be some subtopics that we talk about in addition to those. So y'all know Sam and Corbin. They've already did some stuff with us. If you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, here in the app, Sam and Corbin, they talk with us. What was this? Do bass see color? Probably also another good conversation for you to listen to about what bass actually see our baits as. Go back and check that lesson out on the app. So all right, fellas, let's just jump right into it. People don't really care about us and introducing. I don't like to do that. They can look us up. Let's just start like bare basics. We're gonna talk about the anatomy of the spawn. Something that's really easy to skip over. I don't want to skip over it. I just want to assume that people know nothing.
Okay.
Let's just cover what the spawn actually is. I don't want to just say the bass are spawning and just assume everybody knows what that is.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. Before we go into any of this, if someone's not familiar with who we are, Sam and I, I just want to be very transparent. We are not and do not claim to be fisheries biologists. We are not. But what we do is we interpret scientific data that has been publicly published, and then we digest that and we kind of put put it together in a way that's easy to deliver, to people who are listening, and then you can kind of do with that data what you want to do. But when it comes to the spot, I mean, gosh, Sam and I, we just recently did our two most recent episodes, broke down the spawn, episodes 21 and 22, and there's just so much to talk about. So at the very, very, I guess, beginning, assuming that people know nothing, one thing that Sam and I really learned in our research is that pretty much 100% of a bass's life and life cycle is all leading up to and is holding at the highest importance the spawn. Everything that they do throughout the entirety of the year is all in an effort to best position themselves, yes, to be the healthiest, to be the strongest, to be the most capable of spawning. Their whole lives revolve around the spawn. And so this is like kind of the big moment. I want Sam had a really interesting study that he looked at, talking about kind of the roles between the male and the female and what actually happens as the spawn begins. And since he was the one, Sam, you should take it away on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're starting at the bare basics here, right? So, and I always love to start with anatomy in all of our episodes. So that's where I'm going to jump, initially right into. So when you think male and female bass, you might think like, how can I tell these apart? Can I tell these, different, female or female apart? And really it's very difficult. But on the inside, in the internal anatomy, there's obvious differences. And that's where we have to start. Like, what is the spawn? The spawn is, procreation of new bass. So the population can continue to thrive and continue to grow, right? So the difference between a male and female in their internals was studied at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. And they did a really, really good research article looking at, the sex identification characteristics of largemouth bass through ultrasonic mechanisms. So they really dove in, they, cut a bunch of fish apart, took a bunch of pictures, identified all these different things. And one of the things that they noted that was very interesting that I did not know before looking at this study was that males are muscularly optimized to have more muscle in the tail fin than female bass are. And if you know nothing about the spawn, it's very important that you understand that males typically move up first into shallow water. They try to create a nest for the females to then come join them, where they lay their eggs. Then they do their business, and then past that point, the male then protects the egg. So like the very base of everything, that's kind of how it initially starts. But the male is optimized to be the first male or female to move up on into that shallow area where bass are going to spawn. And it's different like that because the females allocate such a massive internal volume to their ovaries and where they grow these eggs. They said often reaching up to more than 10% of their total body weight. So that's why when you catch, the biggest fish around the spawn or the pre-spawn is because they can expand so much in this area around their ovaries where they're holding these eggs. They work so hard to get to this point throughout all year. It's simply because their anatomy allows them to be able to do this and carry these extra eggs. Those males have to get up there really shallow with their extra tail fin muscles and create that fanning mechanism that clears the debris off of the bottom to allow for the substrate to have that adhesive coating ability so that those eggs can stick when those females come up. So it's so much more complex than just a male fish going up there, creating a nest, a female coming up there, laying some eggs. There's so much more that was, built into each one of these bass to make it successful when their whole life revolves around the spawn working out in their favor.
One thing that I've always been intrigued by, us as fishermen, anytime we catch a fish, especially in the springtime, and it's a bigger fish or a fatter fish, the first thing we say, the females are pulling up, the females are this, the females are that. Almost as if the females are already born 5 pounds. Like they just so it's interesting for you to mention that part about, the females' body anatomy actually being completely different. The males having more muscle mass towards the tail to fan the biz, etc.
Yep.
Uh, I'm probably jumping a little bit ahead here, but one thing I definitely want to talk about is the food source in a given lake and how that can affect the spawn. I have big feelings about that too. Nothing science-based, just experience from, like, for instance, where I live, we have a lot of blueback herring, and fry garters don't exist where I live. They don't hang around.
Really?
They spawn, they do. Like, to find a fry garter is very rare. I'm not saying you don't see any, but it's very rare. Those bass spawn and they get the head.
You asked a couple questions there, but the latter half of that, when you're talking about how there aren't any fry garters, there's actually a significant body of scientific research that could suggest why they don't stay around, and that has everything to do with angling pressure during the spawn.
Yeah.
It is actually unreal. Like, you would not believe how particular and how smart and how aware these fish are in terms of when they're guarding their nests or when they're guarding their fry. I've been caught, and then they leave, right? But it's not just that they leave, but genetically that perpetuates this cycle of creating weaker and weaker and weaker nest guarding males. It's a heritable trait, actually. It's an evolutionary thing that the data that we've observed will, just the fish become less willing to guard the fry. But in terms of the diet stuff, again, I know Sam that Sam dove into some of this too, but we get a lot of comments, and actually we've been getting some recently with some of the stuff we've put out, where we talk about the caloric value and content of a variety of prey, right? And we've done episodes and deep dives on a variety of different prey and the nutritional value that those different prey have, right? And the question that we get all the time is, or the comment we get rather, is there's no way that bass know the caloric value of a given prey compared to another type of prey. And why it's interesting because while we're not necessarily suggesting that a bass is having the conscious thought of, well, the spawn is coming up, and I know that a gizzard shad has more lipid content than, say, like a crappie does, so I'm going to eat that gizzard shad. The data based off of stomach contents that we see in the studies that we've looked at does suggest that there is some connection between consistent dietary shifts that occur leading up to the spawn, most primarily the consumption of fattier based foods, which Sam can dive into now. He read some crazy stuff about how the specific proteins and fat content and lipids of certain prey directly connect to egg development. He knows more about that part than I do.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study done actually over white bass, and there's a lot of correlation here between white bass and largemouth bass and smallmouth bass in terms of the spawn and how the body works. But what they did was they actually looked at reducing lipids in fish food that they fed these white bass versus giving them natural forage like shad that have natural higher level of lipids in them. And they found that with those higher level of lipids, the numbers were like 66% of viability of eggs when they had that higher level of lipids versus like 57%. So like a 9 to 10% difference in viability when they had these lipids. So it just points to the importance, like Corbin was saying, that they have more of these lipids, because that's what allows the eggs to be viable and actually stick to the substrate and then hatch and form into the small fry that you're wanting to have happen. So without these lipids, which are not near as in high levels in whether you look at bluegill, crappie, or crawdad versus gizzard shad or threadfin shad or shad of that, for example. So those, like, You think of pre-spawn, you think of throw a jerkbait, throw a minnow. Like, why though? And this is why. This is exactly why. They need that.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
need
And
those
they know
lipids to not only grow their eggs, but to grow up their fat stores, because they go into this stage of like rationing when they're fry guarding or building a nest, to where those male largemouth bass actually become the weakest they are the entire year throughout those 2 to 3 weeks.
They don't eat.
They
They
don't
just
eat.
sit there and guard. You're right.
Right.
You're right.
Right. And
That's
I
why
have,
they look the way they do.
Yep. That's exactly right.
yeah, it's pretty intense how serious the spawn is on their bodies. And that's why they may not know, like Corbin said, like being able to think like we can think, I need to eat a shad, but they know innately that they need that to provide and to sustain and to, allow these eggs to be viable. So it's very, very important for them to have the right amount of lipids going into the spawn and then coming out of the spawn to rebuild. So that's why we talk about all the time, like when you're grabbing something to throw, like around this time, like a gizzard shad there's never a wrong time to have a shad style bait tied on. A lot of people will want to pick up a plastic as soon as the spawn hits. And you see that super, super common. Guys will just flip and flip and flip and flip all day. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you're going to catch fish. But at the core, anatomy and biology and physiology that it takes for a largemouth bass to sustain its health, it has to have a certain amount of lipids, and it gets the most amount of lipids from gizzard shad.
Yep.
So what do we do? Like a lake like where I live, I'm almost 100% certain. I don't want to say 100% certain. Gizzard shad is not a large part of a bass's diet where I live.
Yeah.
It's gonna be threadfin shad, blueback herring, and probably crustaceans, crawdads, or whatever else lives and crawls on the bottom. So of those 3 or 4 that I just named, I'm assuming just from experience, probably the highest lipid food that they could consume would be the bluebacks. It's the biggest shad forest that we have, and probably the most abundant.
You're probably tied right on. And we're going to talk about blueback here coming soon in our prey series. And we're really excited about that, especially all of the guys around you. We haven't dug into like that research too much, but that would make a lot of sense with what you're saying. And that's probably why the blueback herring spawn, around after the bass spawn is so intense around you guys, because those bass are starting to feed back up on them.
So there's a lot of things that I've learned over the years though. So growing up, I always assumed bass spawn right around the time that the bass finish spawning, the herring spawn, and you have this big clash of the two things running together. What I have learned over the last, I want to say, I'm about 6 years into it now, the herring spawns way before I realized it. A lot of guys in the area already knew that. So when the water gets like, if it hits 60, the herring's probably spawning. And so now what you have, I think, the fact that food source is so prevalent and is so important to them, sometimes it interferes with the bass spawn because they get so focused on eating that the spawn just gets out of whack. It's not, you don't see the same number of fish on the beds that you used to early on when the bluebacks weren't as prevalent as they are now. Like, you used to go and see a lot of big fish on beds. Obviously, everything I'm saying now is very subjective to my experience and not science backed. Everything I'm saying now is just my experience. So it's very subjective. I don't see the numbers of big bass on beds anymore like you did 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Now we have more spotted bass than we do largemouth. And 15 years ago, I would say we were 70-30, 70% largemouth, 30% spotted bass. Wow. Now we're maybe 70% spotted bass, maybe 30% largemouth. So when it comes to the spawn, like I don't know that this is a very, very controversial take that I'm about to say right now. I have said this many times. I don't know that spotted bass always spawn, like all of them. It would not shock me that their bodies just go through the ritual of spawning and they just keep eating because they're so focused on on food that I am not convinced where I've seen some bass at that time of the year and the way they look in early May. Why are you that fat? Why are you that fat in May?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of the lake. I'm not so certain that the food source is so important to them that I don't know that maybe sometimes they squirt their eggs out in the middle of the water and just keep eating. I don't know that. I'm entertaining that idea is what I'm trying to say, that that's possible that happens. Not saying it does, but I think it's worth studying.
Well, yeah, and I actually don't think that that's that crazy. And while we have not looked at any studies, on that specific issue, it is absolutely factual that not all bass do spawn every single year, and there's a number of reasons for that. But one of those reasons is, and some of which we've read about actually, is that the spawn can be disrupted. It can be disrupted for a number of reasons by a number of different ways. And if that happens, maybe that could be part of the reason why you see some of that, but we haven't read anything specific about that, but no reason to disagree,
It would have to be very specific to each waterway too, because like,
I'm sure.
I can have that thought about some lakes here, but a Tennessee River Lake, I've noticed it just traveling, like the way bass pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn is drastically different from fishery to fishery.
Yeah.
Rivers, lakes, reservoirs, Great Lakes, the way that looks and the bass behave is so drastically different on every waterway that I fished. It's the same in theory, but what it looks like, how long it lasts, where they do it is drastically different from waterway to waterway. I got like way off on a tangent on that, but just as you're talking about and stuff,
that's what we're here.
We were supposed to talk about identify male and female and where do bass spawn. That's what I was supposed to do. Now I'm talking about the bluebacks potentially make people make the bass do witchcraft stuff and not spawn.
That's what we're here for, man.
It's my favorite topic to talk about in all of fishing is the spawn by far.
There's so much data out there. I mean, it's such a gigantic topic. I mean, there's just a huge topic. So much research about it.
As a fisherman, it's so interesting because it's the one time of the year where the movements are so drastic that they're easy to point out. It's the one time of the year where you can visually see what we talk about. We talk about these transitions in the fall, whatever that is, and you really don't see it. You talk about it and you say it, but you don't see it.
Right.
It's very subtle. It happens over a month-long period, 2-month-long period. But in the spring, like things happen really fast and you can see them. Like there's no fish, and there's fish everywhere. Like you can physically see it happen and go down. I think there's so much knowledge you can learn from springtime fishing, especially on reservoirs, Clearwater reservoirs. There's just so much knowledge to take in. I think it's just an interesting time to fish.
100%.
Let's do this. Let's talk about where do bass spawn, because and I like let's get like really basic with it too. Let's get into science with like really the basics of where bass like to spawn.
Well, we have a great study on this that we referenced in episode 22 that was all about this exact question. And we actually referenced both studies, study in 21 and 22 about this. Okay, let me pull it up, make sure I've got the right one here. Okay, so there was a study. Yeah, this is a fantastic one. It was titled Enhancing Largemouth Bass Spawning Behavioral and Habitat Considerations. This was from 2002, published by the American Fisheries Society. And over the course of their study, this was a 7-year study that was conducted across a variety of 3 different systems. They did an Arkansas reservoir, they used research ponds in Kansas, and then they did a basin lake in Michigan. So 7 years studying this exact question over 3 different types of bodies of water, okay? And over those 7 years, they studied a total of 645 nests. Okay.
Yeah.
Of all of those 645 over 7 years, 76.7% of those were found on medium textured substrate. What does that mean? That means either a sand or gravel. Okay. The opposites, fine substrate like a silt or very coarse substrate, was significantly avoided. Okay, so that speaks to the very specific type of bottom composition that they're looking for when they're wanting to spawn. Now, one of the things that there's a lot of differing research that we've read on this issue is the depth, right? How deep do bass spawn? And this it truly will differ from lake to lake significantly for a number of reasons. And we'll talk about that probably later when we talk about what triggers the spawn. But in this study, over those 645 nests, they found that across all systems, the mean depth was 4.2 feet deep. Okay, so still relatively shallow, but not, inches, right? And that can happen. Not to say that it can't, they can't spawn in very, very shallow water, but that was the average. Now, this is what we have multiple studies to corroborate this fact. In this study, 85.1% of all nests were located near some type of noteworthy physical structure. Okay.
Oh, I love that.
And so this is going to be, yeah. And so it actually went a little deeper into this. They actually showed a strong preference towards simple woody structure, like logs or stumps or even some big primary branches. Now, what's interesting is that some of these bass were actively avoiding their beds, bed or nesting areas in like really dense structure. And what's interesting there is that those males that were recorded nesting in that complex structure, like a brush pile, right? Mm-hmm. While their nest itself might be protected more from, say, like a human or like an angler, they actually were more susceptible to intrusions by predators like bluegill or other panfish. Actually, this study documented that they were 4 to 7 times higher or more likely to be targeted by a predator than those males that were nesting near a simple structure, right? Actually, to speak to predation in terms of where do bass spawn, in one of those lakes, Pine Lake, which I think was the Michigan reservoir that I talked about, or the Basin Lake, in that lake over the course of 7 years, nearly 90% of largemouth nests were located at least 20 meters offshore in an open water or offshore mesa habitat. And the authors here suggested that the reason why they were doing that was to avoid those predators that are more commonly found right around the bank, like bluegill and stuff like that. In that same lake, when you were talking about, or when we were all talking about like males and largemouth bass becoming smarter over like time, right, from being caught year to year to year in the spawn, this study kind of highlights how that can become a problem, because in one of these lakes, at least 30% of those nesting males were recorded to be within 2 meters of their previous year's nest site. So how we think about, like, at least speaking for myself, like, I think about like traditionally when I think about fish returning to previous year's spawning locations, I think of like salmon, right? Like that's kind of the thing that you talk about, salmon returning. Largemouth bass do this too. Like they return back to areas where they have, maybe not where they hatched themselves, right? But where they have spawned in previous years successfully. So I know that was just like a big data dump there, but that is some really, really good data in terms of like long-term variety of location study that speaks to where do largemouth bass like to spawn.
I know that study was about largemouth bass, but it pointed out one reason. In my area of the country, we have a big problem with the Alabama bass, what we refer to as a spotted bass. That is a big threat to all fisheries, and not a lot of people are realizing it yet. But thinking about some of the facts that you just mentioned and understanding that makes it really obvious why the Alabama bass is even more of a threat to all of our fisheries, because they spawn deeper, meaning their fry doesn't have as many natural predators.
Yep.
They can spawn. They really thrive in clear water fisheries.
Yep.
Which means they can spawn deeper, probably as deep as 15 foot on a lot of places. And there's not going to be as many natural predators there. So their fry that's why they're so prolific, and they take over a fishery so fast, because they can spawn deeper. Their fry has less predators. Where they spawn, there's really nothing else living at that time of the year. So just hearing what you said about largemouth bass and the bulk of them spawning, was it 20 meters from the shoreline? That's a long way.
Yeah,
it is. And I know Sam should dive into this. There's exactly what you were saying, Brian, about different species, making their beds at different depths. There is strong science to explain why that is. And Sam dove kind of deep into this a little bit himself.
Yeah, I mean, but before we get into that, I'm just thinking like the MLF guys are on Table Rock Lake coming up here next week. And I bet you if you watch, the majority of the scoreable bass will probably be spotted bass. With all the rain about to come in and mess up a lot of stuff, and they're going to probably be trying to fish that more clear water areas. I bet you spotted bass probably is the predominant fish caught and weighed in this Bass Pro Tour, which Table Rock Lake did not used to be that. And exactly.
Kentucky spots or Alabama spots? It's Kentucky spots though, right?
It's Kentucky spots.
They get big enough to be like considerable?
Oh yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
They get up to 4.5 pounds in there, and they, a lot of them are around 2 pounds. So
2 pounders are big enough.
Yeah. So I bet that is a major player in this Table Rock tournament, which Table Rock used to be a lot of largemouth and, some smallmouth, and now it's spots and then the other two, it seems like, in a lot of the clear water areas. So yeah, exactly what you're saying. Those spotted bass are, can be very detrimental. But yeah, I mean, why can those spotted bass, be way out there and spawn out there is exactly part of what you said. It's that clear water that allows for a lot of light penetration. Light penetration is one of the main factors that kicks off the spawn. A lot of people contribute it to water temperature more than anything. Water temperature is the easiest thing to look at and the easiest thing to keep track of. So that's why people tend to fault to that. But if you try to track different things like water, like rise or fall in water, and like the amount of sunlight you've gotten recently, we tend to believe that those actually can play a larger factor in the spawn and how fast it moves than temperature alone, because temperature can fluctuate so much. But at a certain time, bass are going to have to move a lot of times to where, we've had very gloomy days here recently around us. And I think, it's kind of pushed the spawn back a little bit. Like, they have not moved up at all for us around here in Missouri. Well, at least around the lakes that I'm fishing. I know that some people have said they've started to in southern Missouri, but around here it's still going pretty slow. So there's a lot of things that affect it. A lot of light variability in the water, and water like rising and falling around this time of the year can actually play a huge role in the spawn.
I mean, this is one of those topics that like I really feel strongly about. Like one of the things that we with our show try to do is like not intentionally, like we're not like Mythbusters type deal, but like so much of the data that we look at is just it directly contradicts what so much of the industry has come to believe so firmly as just gospel truth. Yeah. And I know that we're going to talk about moon phase here in a little bit, but one for people who like to go and read this stuff, we broke this down in episode 21, but to Sam's exact point, there was a study that was called The Effects of Different Photoperiods on Gonadal Development of Largemouth Bass. Okay, and this actually came out, this is a study that came out in 2025. And it examined exactly this issue, exactly this, how light duration controls the biological clock that determines a largemouth bass's reproductive readiness, right? And they did this in a lab so wonderfully where they would have the water temperature be controlled, be stable throughout all of these different groups who were exposed to different levels of light each day, right? They had a group that was exposed to 18 hours of light during the day, a group that was exposed to 12, and then a group that was exposed to 6. And I think I'm getting my numbers right there. If you can always go fact check me on episode 21. That's right. But even when the water temperature was at a constant for all of these fish, the results were insanely different as to when they were spawning and when they were actually ready and capable to spawn, like on a biologically, like when their eggs were developed enough to spawn. So like Sam, we were talking earlier about the importance of like these females getting, sorry, I'm totally nerding out right now, but like when these females like there's so many different things that are happening, and it's honestly incredible. Not only are those females somehow intrinsically and instinctually aware that they need to be consuming prey that has a certain content of lipids that will help develop their eggs, but they are also aware that they need to get sun exposure because that is what allows their ovaries and their eggs to develop. And so that's why you start to see differences in spawning times for clarities of water, right? A lot of people will think like, oh, like dirtier water gets warmer faster, so those fish will spoon faster. That is not that's not what the data suggests.
I stop you right there, because we need to stick a pin in this and like bring this back to what you hear and I have heard, and I have even said. And it all makes sense. There was one clip that I saw from you guys on TikTok that made me really think. I put the two together. What's one thing that everybody says about when you're going in the spring pre-spawn is that the northwest section of the lake warms first. Conventional wisdom would say, okay, since the northwest area of the lake warms the fastest, that's where I need to go because the fish are going to be further along because the water temperature is going to be warm. It's protected from the cold, the wind and the cold fronts and all the things. And time after time after time after time, I have proven that by fishing, that it really doesn't work that way. And it's always the fish down at the dam in the clearest water that move up the fastest. The water can be 51 degrees at the dam, and there's fish suspended on their docks. It all makes sense now because that water is the clearest, allowing the fish to get rays from the sunshine, to get that ambient water to the sunlight allows those fish to spawn quicker than the ones up the river where it's actually warmer. And it defeats all conventional wisdom. You would think the fish in the river spawn first, the fastest, because it's warmest, and it really doesn't work that way because in the river, what is the water typically going to look like? It's going to be more turbid because that's where all the fresh water is coming in from rainfall and spring rains. So usually in most fisheries, not every fishery, most fisheries, the rivers are more stained, more turbid. That water is usually shallower, less water column, warms faster. Conventional wisdom says that's where the fish will pull up first. And it just doesn't always work that way. It's mind-blowing to me because it, like we said, the first thing we think about with spawn, water temperature. Where's this fast? Where's the water temperature? That they feel comfortable and they move up in that warm water, thinking like how humans think.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I'm a human. We always think about fishing in terms of I'm cold, the fish must be cold. They would like to be in that water. That's not how it works. It's more on photo period, more on the water clarity. All that makes sense to me now when we have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean there's a lot playing into that, in terms of like which direction like usually gets the most sun exposure. Like typically the southern banks will get more sunlight exposure, and so that can be beneficial. There's a lot that goes into that, but yeah, light. The other thing too that uniquely kind of lines up with the temperature, right, is you know as we move into the spring and as the water makes its way to be that temperature, the days start to get longer. You start to get more sun exposure throughout the course of the day. And so it all adds up. And like Sam and I aren't saying that like temperature has nothing to do with it. Like
Part of the
you're not
This
it's
is
part right, it's part of the formula. And I think Sam makes a fantastic point that it's so easy for us to turn to the gauge on our screen because that's just the easiest thing to keep track of because you have a hard it's difficult to track like overall like sun exposure on a given lake. But when you're thinking about like, hey, not only is the water temp maybe moving up, but like this past week, we just had 10 days of, I'm just like hypothetically, you could say that like, well, we just had 10 days of like bluebird skies. Like that, it's not necessarily that like, oh, the water temp is going to reach the right temp where it's going to trigger everything to happen at one time. It's that these fish are able to essentially let their eggs bake right with the sun to be able to get to that point where they need, or it's time to spawn.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, Corbin and I are going to fish in a tournament this weekend at the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri, and we've been brainstorming, and a lot of people are going to be fishing up shallow, trying to catch those spawning fish. But the weather leading up to this weekend is very cloudy and very rainy, and if they haven't moved up yet, there's probably a high likelihood that the majority of those bigger fish are going to still be a little bit deeper before they make their move shallow to make those beds. But people just want to be up there shallow, flipping that plastic so fast, and that's why we study this, so we can understand a little bit more of why, and it can give you that confidence to not do what everyone else does, because that's what the market or that's what the fishing industry tells you should be doing then.
So one thing that I noticed here at home, so I fish Lake of the Ozarks. Our lakes are very much similar. We don't have as much rock Lake of the Ozarks, very similar. So even though you haven't had the sun, I'm willing to bet almost like how plants do, the bass are looking for the sun, so they're probably going to be sitting way higher in the water column. Forward Facing Sonar has shown us this. So anywhere that they could use somewhere to suspend around, like you said, a lot of guys are going to want to flip heavy jigs, Texas rigs around wood. But if one thing that I was fortunate enough to start understanding early on here around where I live, a lot of people did skip jigs and shaky heads and stuff around docks. I don't want to say I was the first one to bring like a wacky rig or Nico rig around the house, but it's definitely probably early on in the game.
Yeah.
Not many people thinking about that. Finding places for bass to suspend when there's not much sunlight, I think will work for you, because they're still going to be high in the water column looking for that sunlight, looking to catch whatever are available. And that can look like a bunch of different things. Bridge pilings, obviously the floating docks. I have a lesson in the app about how to fish laydowns and how all laydowns aren't created the same. Some laydowns don't touch the bottom and they like suspend out, hanging laydown. Something that the fish can like get under and suspend versus set on the bottom. Because I can imagine they're still going to be shallow, but shallow can look so many different ways. Those big community docks that they have, I call them marina docks.
Yep.
That takes a lot of effort to fish, and a lot of people won't fish that because it takes a lot of effort and time to get around all the boat lifts and the cables and all the things that are there, the crossbars. Those
Trust us, we are up in that stuff. We got on a bite on this same tournament a couple years ago where we could not get bit unless we were behind the cables. Our pattern was we'd go behind the cable, then we'd go all the way out and around. Behind the cable, all the way out and around, behind the cable. So we're up in that stuff, man.
what I did at Ozarks when we went in 23, that's exactly what I was just fishing the
Yeah.
rock behind the cables. They get
Mhm.
here at home, we can see them. I kid you not, the cables is a pattern. They actually
Oh.
will spawn right under the
100%.
cable. Cable goes in the water, makes that bow, they will spawn right under the cable. It's
Yep.
the
Yeah.
craziest thing ever. But it goes along with what you said. What did you just say? Where did bass spawn? It's like 4 meters, 2 meters within some
Yep.
type of
Simple
we don't
structure.
have wood. Yeah,
Simple
We don't
structure.
have wood. There's not going to be but so much wood in Lake Hartwell. There's just not that much wood because a lot of the shoreline's developed. So
Yeah.
Right.
you're not only so many stumps. There's
Right.
only so many laydowns. So that cable is probably the next best thing to a significant structure for them. So they get right under it.
Yep.
It's a cool thing to watch. That's why I say like the spawn is so important for you to be on the water watching and seeing things. It just teaches you so much about bass fishing. I tell people you need to sight fish. I know it's very controversial in a lot of areas of our industry, but you need to sight fish. There's so much to get from sight fishing, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can certainly learn a lot.
Yeah, there was one other thing you hit on, Mike. You did change the slide. Yeah, I want to get to the next slide. Let me hit on one other thing you were talking about. We're moving super slow tonight, but I don't care because this is good stuff. One thing that you hit on, it was talking about water temperature, sunlight. I wanted to point out one thing to the group. It's really easy. I know at least for where I live in the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and our little Alabama, our little region here. It's a little different where climates where it's probably a lot colder. But there's a point in the year. It's really just how we have our winter solstice, where the days start to get longer. That is the winter solstice, right? Where it's the shortest the days are going to be all year, and it starts to get longer. There's this deal where the water temperature is going to bottom out. And I've noticed that anytime the water temperature bottoms out, and it's probably not going to get any colder than that, things start to happen really fast. The water temperature doesn't have to warm up for fish to start to move to trigger this pre-spawn spawn activity. When the days get longer, just by the days getting longer, even if the air temperature is cold, the water temperature can start to either stabilize or even rise just because the photo period, just because the days are longer and there's more ambient sunlight. The temperature will kind of start to creep up. And you're like, dude, it's still cold. It's like it's a high of 38 today. It's a high of 45. But I noticed it was like 41 yesterday. Now it's 45. It just comes from the days continuously getting longer as we get into the season. And like those fish know that things will start to change on your lakes without any kind of drastic air temperature warming. So you kind of got to keep your eye. What I'm getting at is, don't be scared to start thinking about the things we're talking about now before everybody else does.
Yeah.
If it hits like for us 50, if it's 50 in March, 55 in March, you probably won't start peeking around. And it doesn't mean that the bass are spawning. You can see them setting on their docks. You'll see them if you're fishing stain water. They'll start setting on that one stick that's setting in the middle of a pocket. Like Lake of the Ozarks got that shelf rock stuff that you guys have there. You can start pitching your jig at that stuff. They'll start setting up on a lot of that stuff way earlier than we give it credit for, as long as the days are starting to get longer.
Well, one of the things that, and I know that this might not be a specific question, but it does speak to giving people just a little bit of an idea of what's going on here. So we had one of the studies that we looked at. It was titled "Separating Genetic and Environmental Influences on Temporal Spawning Distributions of Largemouth Bass," and it was looking at a number of things. But one of the interesting facts that it came out was kind of the length of the spawn, right? And this kind of goes to what you were saying about like being aware and cognizant of what cues might be bringing fish up, and it begs the question of like, well, what is the immediate trigger? Does it all happen at one time? And how do I know that it's happening at one time? Right. And that's like, Sam and I have talked about this, like when you're fishing this time of year, what's the question that, at least that we have is like, am I fishing right now for a pre-spawn fish? Am I fishing for a spawning fish? Am I fishing for a post-spawn fish? And I'm going to feel that way probably until August. Like,
Yeah.
what is going on, right? And the reality is that, at least in this study, which I think some of this data can be extrapolated over, is that um, one of these spawning periods, this was actually at Okeechobee, lasted for 146 days.
Long
And then
time.
another the same study at Lake Seminole lasted for 97 days. And they started spawning at a wide variety of temperatures. In the study, one of the locations they tested started at a range between 54 and 59. The other group in another lake started at a range between 60 and 69. And it's just this, it's a long drawn out thing. It's not this like overnight, like, oh my God, the water's hit 64 degrees, like 62 to 64. I need to get out there right now or they're going to be done spawning in a week. And one thing that we did learn that happens super freaking fast that blew my mind, is that the role that the females play in this actually is incredibly fast. Like they are up, spawn, lay their eggs, and are back out deep within like 7 days or less.
Okay.
And it is
Hey, I
a
gotta
fast
comment about
thing.
this. I got to comment about this. So I remember one of my northern buddies saying, if you catch a smallmouth on a bed, it's almost always the buck because the females do their thing and they get the heck out of there immediately.
Yep.
I've definitely noticed that, to speak to the other point you were talking about, the further south you go, or I don't want to say further south, but I guess it really is, the less the seasonal change, the more drawn out the spawn is. So in Florida, the fish spawn over a long. Nothing gets
exactly
in
right.
Nothing gets in there. Like they don't bite that good in the morning. They wait to 10, 12 o'clock. It's just like nothing is ever really fast and furious. The spawn lasts forever. Even here, like the spawn, they kind of do somewhat of a setup, and then they spawn, and then there's a post spawn. When you get up north, it's like the ice breaks, they spawn, and then they're doing their normal stuff all the rest of the year. It's the further you go north, the shorter the spawn is, it seems like. So that's something that I think we all have to take into account where we live and how this conversation relates to wherever you are.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And then I know that, we've got the graphic change here as to different species. Sam, you got to talk to him about the smallie stuff that you read about their nest making and their habits and stuff like that, because it's actually pretty interesting and it is different than largemouth. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, just for, northern fish in general, like kind of like you were saying, is we looked into like fractional spawning and how much that's actually happening and if that's happening. And it seems, like you said, to happen a lot less up north than it is down in Florida, because Florida can spawn over such a long period of time. Before I hop into that, I want to say one of the studies that we looked at, though, spoke to the fish that spawned first had oftentimes turned into being the bigger largemouth bass. And oftentimes the genetic makeup of those females and males that went up and spawned earlier were those bigger fish. So a lot of times people say those bigger females spawn first. That's somewhat true because the genetic makeup and the genetic like timeline in their head tells them they spawned earlier, they grew up to be successful, they are larger than normal. Having those longer growing periods of time for that first age group of that fry makes all of the difference in their future growth. But yeah, to speak more on that, of those smallmouth, they're super, super specific nest builders, like much more specific than largemouth bass, where largemouth bass will nest or, make their beds on a lot of different substrates, like Corbin was talking about. Now they want it to be more of a medium, rock or, not quite a silty area, but they still will do on that, from silt to different substrates to root mats to root balls to trees, all these different things, where smallmouth bass have to be very specific to where they're on gravel, cobblestone, small little chunk rock. And it is almost the exact same nest everywhere you look for these smallmouth bass. And they're, 30 millimeters around and they're fanned out, almost perfect every time. These smallmouth bass are very specific because it affects how well the water can filter over their eggs so they don't get viruses, and they're much more successful at spawning. And that's what, I can't remember who we were talking to, but they were talking about how they don't understand how smallmouth bass are fished so heavily up north on the rivers in New York, but yet year after year the bags keep getting bigger and bigger because they're very commonly sight fished and fished for very hard during the spawn. But that's because they're so selective in where they put their nests. Like Corbin said, we can put them deeper. They can go up to 20 feet sometimes where they're protected in there, kind of like you're saying with the spotted bass. And then they survive that much easier. They're deeper because the water's clear. They can get that photo period, that sun down there in that lower level of water. And then, it's just crazy the differences that come between a largemouth bass and a smallmouth bass, and why a smallmouth bass can be so successful. I also read a study that was really, really cool, talking about the differences between a male smallmouth bass and a male largemouth bass protecting their beds. And what happened in this study was they fished for multiple different bass on beds for each species, and it came down to 70% of the smallmouth bass bit the bait off of bed, where only 54% of largemouth bass bit the bait off of bed. So it just shows how much more aggressive those smallmouth bass are in protecting their nests over a male largemouth bass, which was very crazy to me.
It's almost like the urgency for a bass up north to protect his bed there's a lot more urgency there than it is down south.
And that could play into the fractional spawning, because they go at once a lot more times. They got to make that work, or their spawn does not work, type of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So
it also makes me think with it being so important for them, the urgency for it to happen now, it makes me wonder how important are the environmental factors that we mentioned, such as the sunlight, the cloudy days, water clarity, all that. Do they have time to worry about all of that?
Right.
As small, I wonder, do they don't potentially, it's not as influential on smallmouth spawn as it is on largemouth.
Yeah, I don't know the exact, there's exact study on that, but that makes sense. It seems like they're in a lot more of a hardy, spawner, those northern largemouth bass too. Like they get one wave, they get one chance type of thing. Yeah. Before that water is, past the spawn, their lights past this, and light all comes right at the same time, where they have those longer growing seasons down south, in Florida and Texas, where they can do that over a long period of time. So it would make sense that they have to be more aggressive when they spawn, and that's probably just innately born into them. And the time that they spawn, like they're so genetically, controlled in a way to how they were raised and how they were, spawned. A lot of that flows over to them to make sure that their next brood is successful. And the crazy part is it takes a bass a lot of times until they're 3 years old to be able to spawn. So it is very important. That bass, the spawn is so important for their success.
So basically, in a lot of places, a bass is a 3-pounder before they can successfully produce eggs.
Well, 3 years old, not necessarily 3 pounds, but you might be right on that depending on where you're at.
Depending on where you are, obviously that 3-year-old fish. I know a lot of the places up north, like when we catch a 4-pound smallmouth, I've heard reports that those fish could be sometimes in the teens of years.
Exactly.
I've heard that before. I don't know how true that is.
It's wild.
So, which I've heard here, like in my area, southeast region, that usually a 3-pound bass is probably about 3 to 4 years old.
Yeah.
I've heard that. In a lot of places, obviously it's still going to vary from fishery to fishery, but about 3-pound bass, about a pound a year is what they can grow up to.
Right.
Let's talk about this. I know we're moving kind of slow. I do want to try to get to a few questions. Maybe we'll just only have the moon. Maybe we'll save moon phase. Moon phases could be part of something else. Let's just wrap up this part. I do want to talk about Florida largemouth bass versus the northern strain and some of the things you guys found out about those two different species. And then we'll just take questions from there and then wrap it up. That sounds good, so we don't have a 2-hour podcast.
The only thing that I'll say before we do this is that, and we can save the moon phase thing for whenever, but
yeah,
a little shameless hint at Science of the Strike here, and Bilat, we would love to talk to you more about this off the public record here, but we are working on something that we think will be the biggest thing that Science of the Strike ever does. And we have found, and we talked about this a little bit, and I won't get into the details of it all. Obviously, the moon phase is one of those controversial topics because, there's a lot of opinion on it. But the reason why we kind of have held our ground that we don't think that it has any impact on things is because we have not seen any data that would be able to suggest that it does. And so that's where we think kind of, that's why we don't say that we believe that the moon phase does impact things, but we'll have to chat with you more on that. But we can let's get on to north and southern strain stuff.
Yeah, there's some findings to suggest that maybe there's differences in how long one species of largemouth bass spawn versus the other, and maybe some other things too. Is that correct?
Well, and Sam, I think we'll also be able to speak to this too. We looked at a variety of studies, both that actually encapsulated northern, strains and Florida strains. But the one that I actually looked at was one of the ones that I already referenced. Was this study that happened between Lake Okeechobee and Lake Seminole, and actually some ponds that occurred or that existed kind of in central Florida. And what they were trying to do is, Seminole is like North Florida, Okeechobee is South Florida, and then they kind of did this experiment kind of in the middle. And while I don't think that this probably gets to the heart of your question as it relates to the difference in strain, there was a difference in how even actually, that's not true. These were different strains. It was a Florida largemouth bass, and then I've got this acronym typed out here, the integrated largemouth bass, which is a mix between a Florida and a northern strain. So kind of like a F variety, right, of a northern strain. And
probably like TPA or something like that.
Sure.
I would imagine. Yeah.
And so this study, while it was all conducted in Florida, like I said, found that the Florida strain median hatch dates of the spawn were 11 days earlier than those of the northern strain or that northern strain hybrid. It found that the Florida strain, and I thought this was interesting. My brain would have thought the contrary on this. It found that the Florida strain bass actually initiated their spawning at cooler temperatures than the northern strain, or compared to the northern strain, right?
Sure.
And it also found, as you kind of were getting at, that the Florida strain bass spawned over significantly greater time. That was 146 days, whereas that northern variant spawned over 97 days, which goes right to the heart of what you were just saying. And so that's a little bit of the science there. And part of the reason why we saw that longer time and also the cooler temperatures is because they're exposed to more sun. They're exposed to more light. And that's where you kind of start to see connections of the dots between some of these studies. That was the primary study that I looked at as it relates to the difference in strain there. I can't remember if Sam did something on this too.
Yeah, the only thing that I really had on this, and I think is important to understand, is the approximate egg count that comes from a fish length. Okay, so normally northern strain largemouth bass are going to be shorter and less weight than maybe your Florida strain largemouth bass as they've been genetically bred, right? So a fish that's 12 inches per se, has approximately 11,000 eggs, where a fish that's 20 inches that you might get more around your Florida strain or your Florida lakes, you can have over 100,000 eggs in a fish like that. So 10x the amount of eggs. So it just goes to show the differences that come with like why Florida and Texas and those southern states lakes can have such a better largemouth bass population, and why they're probably trying to spread the F1 or Florida strain bass up to the north, right, to try to help out and increase the size of those fish, so that in turn the spawn can be so much better up there in the north. So it just goes to show, like, for pure fish size, it can make such a big difference between northern strain and Florida strain because of the growing seasons that they have.
Yeah. I think one thing that I linked together that I never thought about until you guys mentioned this, obviously a lot of the Tennessee River Lakes have the F1s. I guess that's what we call them, the Guntersvilles, the Pickwicks, all that have the Florida strain largemouth in them. One thing that you said that really clicked for me is the Florida strain being able to start the spawning ritual in cooler water, meaning that their fry get ahead of the northern largemouth before brim start to spawn, before all of the other species have a chance to prey on the fry, giving them a head start. So I know the genetics of a Florida bass potentially makes it a bigger bass, but I think the fact that the spawn is more successful because of the way that fish spawns makes it a more resilient species. Because, I mean, obviously, like, if you think of Guntersville, Pickwick, or any of those Tennessee River lakes, those lakes, Chickamauga, they pump out, like, a lot of double-digit fish. And double digits are hard to – they just don't exist. You don't see many double-digit fish in public fisheries anymore. But it makes sense when you start to put all of these elements that you guys have mentioned together about how bass spawn and anatomy and the things, the challenges that bass have. It makes sense why that plays into F1s being bigger fish.
Yep.
Aside from genetics, aside from just genetics.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that they have to avoid, in the beginning, starting their spawn that early, is no longer the bluegill, like you're saying, or the shad, or the goby, whatever is, attacking their eggs. It's more of the water fluctuation that normally happens in that early spring, the cold front, the snowstorm, all of those things. But you might not get that down in the south on the Tennessee River system, that you're talking about. So, like, that's why it can be so different and so hard for those Florida strain to maybe make their mark up north like they can in the south.
Got it. Michael, let's answer a few questions before we have a benediction. Do we have any?
Yeah, we've got a few. Let's see here. Alex Sterling asked, what are most of the predators that eat the bass eggs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, panfish. Yeah, some type of brim, bluegill, crappie, green-eared sunfish. Yeah, any of those. Panfish can be hugely detrimental to the fry and the eggs. And actually, the eggs are when it's before they're. We learned this, that they're most commonly attacked. The fry or the eggs or the hatchlings, whatever you want to call them, are most frequently attacked prior to that fry stage that we're all used to seeing, like the big school or whatever. They're most susceptible and most targeted in the second of 4 stages of their growth period. There's I don't have my notes right in front of me on this, but there are like formal names for the development of like the egg all the way to the fry. And there's like the first, stage, which is just like the brand new egg. Yeah. And then the next, yeah, I can't, yeah, something like that. And then the next stage is when they actually like hatch out of the egg, but are still like stuck to the bottom and like stay down and are like feeding off of like the egg that they've kind of hatched out of. That is when the panfish most frequently will attack the hatchlings or whatever. And that's at that point, you still can't even see, you can't see them with your own eye when you're out of the water, right? Like until they are actually like swimming around. And so just because you don't see like a school of fry does not mean that 1, there aren't eggs there, and 2, that they haven't already hatched. They just might be so small that from a boat you couldn't really see them.
Yep.
Right.
And while we had a question just to verify, it's only the males that do the fry guarding.
Yes.
Is that right, or do the females
Yes.
hang out too?
Mm-mm.
Right.
You were saying something right there. I was speaking with the fisheries biologist here in South Carolina. It was about pond management, and one of the most dangerous fish in any pond is the crappie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they spawn early and they eat a lot of the bass fry. And so if you have a pond that's stunted, they were mentioning that the best way to get that pond balanced is to kill as many crappie as you can. Because obviously they also spawn very early too, so they don't have any natural predators. There's nothing to eat their eggs. So controlling the crappie is in a small pond is probably the best thing you can do to have a healthy largemouth population.
Yep.
So when you think about it on a grand scale in a lake or reservoir or something like that, it starts to make sense why certain lakes have bigger fish, or why spawning earlier is more important than later.
Yeah.
Another good reason to fill a cooler with crappie, I guess.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
Yeah, I actually have 2 ponds here locally that were like hired guns to go clean out the crappie in.
Nice.
All right.
What else?
Can y'all? This is. Let's see here. Can we explain how you get mixed bass? I guess it's a little bit in the context of the spawn. Like, how do you end up with mixed species of bass? Butts.
The 2 different species have slicks. But I guess the 2, we have like maybe 3 or 4. I know in our lakes, there's a mixing of species between the spotted bass. We have a native spotted bass, if you want to call it. It's not really a spot, but a Bartram bass. Those ran native in our rivers for a long time. And then when we introduced the Alabama bass, there's a lot of mixing going on in our fisheries between Alabama's and the native Bartram bass, which when I was a kid, we used to call them red eyes. So the red eyes have been eradicated by Alabama bass. That species may one day be extinct because of the Alabama bass and the mixing of them. It's a very serious problem, and we don't talk about it enough. But the Alabama, like smallmouth fisheries, Alabama bass will wipe out a smallmouth fishery in the southeast. They can absolutely wipe them out by interbreeding. It's a very serious problem, and nobody talks about it. If you talk to any biologists from around there, they'll let you know how serious it is, but it's not loud enough in our area. It is a very serious problem. And the Alabama bass has now reached as far north as Virginia. So imagine if we get Alabama bass in, I don't know, our Great Lakes or something. I don't think that's going to happen, but what if it did?
Yeah.
It'd be a problem.
Yikes.
Now I can't speak about
to answer the question about different, variants. I mean, we didn't like dive into this, but I think it's probably safe to say that, I mean, that's just typical like crossbreeding. Like that's just going to be a whatever XYZ bass that ends up spawning with another bass, and that's how you get your crossbreeds. But we haven't broken that down. That might be interesting to look at, like a family tree of different subspecies. That might be kind of interesting.
It is interesting because if you actually study the species of bass, like a smallmouth bass and a largemouth bass genetically are 2 different to interbreed. A different spotted bass can interbreed. A spotted bass and a smallmouth can interbreed. That is a very interesting topic. It's almost like studying plants. But there's families that we all call them bass, and they're from different families. They're not the same. Like the smallmouth bass is from the brim family, I think it is. And then there's all these different subspecies of smallmouth bass, neoshos, and all these other things. It's a bunch of different subspecies.
We should do an episode on that. That'd be interesting just to like do an entire breakdown of like, we're going to talk about all the different subspecies of bass and just do this giant family tree. That'd be a cool project. That actually would be a pretty cool project, because I bet there's hundreds. I bet there's hundreds of just breakdowns and like this specific subvariant is only native to this creek arm in the one place of this place,
And they eat red jerk baits.
Yeah.
Just remember to clean your live well.
There's like the smallmouth where you guys live in the Midwest, it's not the same smallmouth that I have in the Carolinas, Tennessee. Like this is Tennessee smallmouth. There's a northern strain of largemouth. I think there's a couple up there up north. There's a bunch of different smallmouth species. They are not the same, and they don't look the same when you start looking at them side by side. They look drastically different. Same thing with largemouth. If you pay attention to a northern largemouth, like a true, I don't know, like a Champlain largemouth, the tiniest little eyeball ever. Tiny little eyeball. And then like the ones we catch where I live, they're really big eyeballs.
Right.
Like a big 8-pounder will have, you see whites of his eyes sometimes.
Right.
But it's a very interesting topic to learn like the families and study the species of bass, because it's the family is huge, man.
We'll have to do that. We'll have to do that for sure.
Yeah,
Hey, there's one follow-up question. Is that a mean mouth that the Alabama guys reference?
mean mouth, smallmouth, and a spotted bass.
Some guy just caught. Yeah, some guy in a tournament. I don't know if it was during the Classic or when it was. Just caught like a. Yeah, I was gonna say like it was like a total like the video of this guy. I don't remember what pro it was. He was like,
Dakota?
"What did I just catch?"
Yeah.
He's like, "What did I just catch? Like, what is this?" And they put it in a tank and everything. They were like studying it. Like, I've never seen something like that.
I don't know if they ever got verified, but at the time it was debatable if it was like the record for the
record.
record.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's cool.
It's like a 7-pounder, if I'm not mistaken. Did he call it the Classic?
Something like that. It was big. It was crazy big. Yeah.
Big old bass.
All right. Other than, you ready for another question?
Yeah. We got anything else?
Oh yeah. I think I've got like 2 or 3 more. If we got time.
We'll go to 9:30. Whatever we can do by 9:30.
All right. Other than the tail beat up on a bass, what are other indicators that the bass are spawning?
Oh, I got a lot to say on that one.
That's a good question. So like there's probably a few things that might give you a little bit of an idea of where they're at in the spawn. And this is certainly not dispositive in either direction, but like some good hints I think could be a lot of times those females will get real kind of bulbous around the time of the spawn in like down near their anal fin, and that kind of goes to what Sam was saying about the physiology and the anatomy of the ovaries, right? The other thing kind of on the contrary would be that, the studies that we looked at, a number of them talk about how the males just absolutely starve themselves while they're in that guarding phase, like post like females having laid their eggs, they just do not eat. And if they do eat, it is out of a defensive thing. And sometimes if you will start to catch those just total slivers, of a male, like kind of around that time. And that can kind of maybe cue you in and like indicate to like where things are at. Right. But Sam, can you think of anything in terms of like, I can't think of anything else.
I don't think we saw anything
visually.
Like typically, maybe, just the red on the tail. I was thinking beat up mud on their bellies, or.
In my experience, a lot of times by the time you see the physical signs of the spawn, it's pretty much over. When you see the physical signs on the fish, beat up tails, dorsal fins are kind of raggedy, it's more towards the tail of it is what it and that's obviously very area specific. A couple of things that I think as a fisherman you should stay attuned to. Reaction bite baits become non-existent almost. Getting the fish to come out and hit a jerk. Obviously, you live up north, it's a lot different. But as far as largemouth fishing, you're catching them cranking. Now they're not. You can't catch them cranking. You probably need to start slowing down, using baits that are a little slower, more intentional casts, more precise casts. Think about what he said about the spawn and what fish start to spawn on, and start fishing those objects with a lot of intention. So what I mean by that, instead of you casting a chatterbait by that one stick that's laying in the pocket or a dock piling or a step, now you become more intentional and you use a shaky head, a jig, a stick bait, and you let that bait sink. If that's the only way you can get bit, more than likely the fish are probably spawning. So when they go from reaction, it's going, everything's great, you're catching and laughing, having a lot of fun, and you go next weekend and you can't get them to hit a chatterbait, a crankbait, a spinnerbait, all those things. Those fish are kind of hunkered down and getting more guard mode instead of a feed mode. there's like several different stages of pre-spawn. There's a pre-spawn, like where fish are out, they're eating, they're feeding, they're active, they're just showing that butt, and everybody's having fun. And then it gets to this pre-spawn where fish kind of they start to look for the sunlight, just like they were saying. And they kind of start floating around under docks. They get in the middle of pockets and they just float around. They're not really active. And so when that bite slows in the spring, when the weather feels so good, it feels so good. I should be catching thousands of fish and you can't get bit. They're probably spawning. Now, the low-hanging fruit of knowing when they're spawning is to get up there and start looking for them. Start looking shallow. Go to the clearest part of your lake. Get in some pockets. Get it anywhere it's flat, and literally just look for fish. The biggest problem I notice with fishing with people, sight fishing, is when I say, hey, look, there's a fish swimming right there. They're literally looking to see the whole bass swimming by. You got to train your eye to look for shadows and look for movement when you're sight fishing. You're not always going to see this big, giant whole profile of a fish when you're sight fishing. You got to train your eye to look at things, look at the different textures on the bottom. You got to train your eye to look for movement, like just very subtle movement. That was dark. Now it's not dark. That was moving and now it's 2 foot to the left. It's very subtle things you got to train your eye to look for. And it just comes with time. When I fish with people and they don't have much experience sight fishing, they usually struggle for the first few hours until they realize what to look for. Anybody can see them. A lot of people use the excuse that, oh, my sight's bad. But if you know what to look for, you can still see them. I don't see the whole fish. I just see movement a lot of times. And I can see like that green ain't the same green as that green. And you make a cast to it and it moves off. You get used to using your boat to flush fish so you can actually see them. That's another good way to do it. In Florida, a lot of times in where it's a little bit more turbid water, you can't use your boat to flush them off because you have to get close to the fish to see it. So the best way to do it in Florida or in tannic or dark water is to actually set your boat still, get invisible for a minute, and then start to watch, and then start to look around. Because the water is so shallow, those fish can push off a bed or push off a flat and you can't see them because your range of seeing the fish is much shorter. But where I live, where I have 10-foot visibility, I can actually use the boat to show me where the fish are. I can just push up in a cove and they'll start scattering off. I can see the fish 50 feet in front of me where I live. Yeah. I can't do it in Florida. So just some low-hanging.
You talked about this is a very small thing, but it's just so true with all the science that we've looked at, not just in this episode, but others. You talk about getting invisible. If there's ever a time when you're out fishing and you're fishing in your sun shirts, and we've all got a million different colors of sun shirts, springtime especially is not the time to be wearing your fluorescent orange, crazy bright colored sun shirts. For that reason, that bass tend to be statistically shallower. They, as we've discussed in our vision and all different types of episodes, are keenly capable of looking out of the water and are capable of remembering predators and predation that comes from humans, and they can associate being caught and the negative experiences that come along with the presence of humans, one of which includes what those humans might look like in terms of like color, like that's something that bass can see and remember and stuff like that. And so I'll spare the detail on all that, but you're talking about being invisible. Dude, we make a very conscious effort to specifically, I mean, we do this kind of year round now, but specifically this time of year to make sure that we're wearing something that is going to match the background of the sky. We wear a lot of light blues. We wear a lot of light grays. We wear a lot of whites. You won't see us generally in the springtime wearing like a brighter color shirt if we've got one,
I had an argument for that, but you just destroyed my argument. I used to see a lot of guys like kneeling down the boat, sight fishing and stuff. And I'm like, dude, your boat's 25 foot long. You're 5 foot tall. I used to argue that, but then you just said something that I didn't consider is the sky. Mm-hmm. Looking up in the water, it's your silhouette against the sky. I didn't think of it that way before. My mind was like, you're going to. My mind initially was just thinking, okay, I got a whole 20 25 foot with the engine and the trolling motor. It's 25 foot long, 7 foot wide. Come on, bro. I don't know what mine was initially, but when you think about it in the context that you just said about the sky, that does make sense to wear something that is at least complementary of whatever the skyline is that day.
That's just something that we do.
That all comes back to Snell's theory, and we can talk about that next episode. But it's like the bass's limit, it's like 45-degree angle off the top of its head. And then the water actually becomes a mirror. So they might not actually see your boat at a certain distance out. But what they can see is out of that water at that angle. If you're standing up, they have a chance to see you actually a little bit better than they may be able to see your boat if your boat positioning is like good and away from them.
Yeah, so, they could see you before they see the boat.
And a chance sometimes. Crazy stuff. Lots of science there.
All right, Mike, we'll take one more and then we'll
all right. Let me pick a good one. Maybe this will be quick. What about the age of bass? How does that affect when they spawn?
That's probably a good question.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit. 2 to 3 years old is when likely you're going to see those bass start to be able to spawn. As they grow, their eggs become more in terms of numbers, higher numbers, larger fish. So the larger the fish, the older the fish, the more you need to make sure you're going to take good care of those fish if you catch them around the spawn, because those are the ones keeping the population going.
Yeah, the and with that, again, that study that we talked about, that's not exclusive. Like if a bass does not have to be that old in order to spawn exclusively. There are bass that are observed that are, like the study that I referenced about the gonadal development through sunlight was looking at 1-year-old bass. But that was a lab study to look at the development of their, sex organs that could, lead to spawning if they did. But it just goes in hand with sunlight too, man. That says a lot about development, even more than age as well, right? It's just a given development of those organs throughout that kind of pre-spawn period that leads up to the spawn as well.
Perfect. Guys, this is a good conversation. Like I said, this is probably my favorite subject to talk about when it comes to fishing.
So much.
There's so many layers to it. There's so many things to consider. I don't think there's been a year in my life that I have not learned something new somewhere between February and May.
Yep.
Every year I get a new understanding of how like all this works. I'm only like 4 or 5 years in the start. We never studied spotted bass and how they spawn. I didn't until like 5 years ago. I was like, oh, you probably ought to really start considering spotted bass and what are they doing during this time? So very interesting conversations, a lot of layers. If you're fit, like I don't care where you live in the country, you need to be fishing right now because this is the most important. You can get the most data points for the rest of the year right now. Like everything that is happening right now is going to help you the rest of the year.
100%.
So listen, you got kids, drop them suckers off, man. You got to go. Hey, I know you just got a new baby, but listen, man.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The wife's been great. I'm getting to go fishing this weekend in a tournament, so I can't complain one bit.
Bro, you gotta go. Gotta go now. Like you gotta go now. In all seriousness, though, it's very, very important time of the year. Appreciate you, Sam and Corbin, y'all sharing all your findings with us here in the app, and then we're sharing this TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. Appreciate you guys being.
Yeah, no, of course, we appreciate coming on. We always have a blast. Yeah. Always, you can always check out all of our stuff in long form too on, all the places you find podcasts and stuff like that. We do deep dives on all this type of stuff. But yeah, man, the spawn, you could talk about the spawn for, 10 episodes. It's just, it's just so dense because their whole life. Maybe you should. Yeah, honestly, we did a 1 and a 2, spring. But we probably could do every single spring. We could do an episode or episodes on it. But yeah, critical stuff, man. But as always, we just love doing these episodes with you. We super appreciate it. It's so much fun. We learn a lot, talking to you about this. using your experience and extrapolating it over on top of the data that we, bring into it. It's just, it's super interesting stuff. Super interesting stuff.
It really is. You guys, if you want to get the whole deep dive on this subject that we're talking about today, or any other things that they do at Science of the Strike, you can find them on, I want to say almost all the podcasting platforms,
Yeah.
Spotify. Just tell them everybody where they can go.
Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, www.scienceofthestrike.com, where we have all of our sources, sponsors, merch, just kind of centralized place to find all of our stuff.
Yep.
So that's where you can find it.
Right on, guys. Y'all have a good rest of your night. I appreciate you tuning in with us, guys, in the app. For people in the app, see you guys at the retreat this coming Thursday, Friday. Let's go catch some bass, man. The fishing is good. All of this stuff that he talked about today, you'll be able to apply at the retreat this weekend. So looking forward to seeing everybody there. If you're watching on the TikTok webs, on the Instagram webs, the Facebook webs, the YouTube webs, register. You still can do it. You can register at the door, but if you register now, we'll have a gift for you at the door when you get there. It's going to be a good time. You can hang out with us and fish on Thursday and Friday. We have a dinner planned for you on Friday night that is completely paid for. And then we have all day Saturday. We're going to hang out and talk fishing and learn some stuff that maybe you never heard it before. So look forward to seeing you guys there. You can register, sufschool.com.
Heck yeah.
Right on, guys. Y'all have a good rest of your night. Thanks for tuning in with us. See you later.
Appreciate it, Be that.
Thanks so
See
much,
you
man.
guys.
We'll talk to you later.